Today we're back with our third installment of Reference Points. And Reference Points is a series we began a few years ago where we really take a look at an entire family of watches, beginning from the very beginning, moving all the way up through today. And with me is a very special guest, a good friend of mine, a former HODINKEE contributor, Mr. Eric Wind, now of the Christie's Watch Department. And today we're going to be talking about the Omega Speedmaster. So Eric, if you could, give us a little bit about the earliest history of the Speedmaster.
The Speedmaster was never designed to go into space. That's one of the very interesting things about the watch. It was designed for car racers, particularly in Italy. Around 1956, they began making a prototype, and then in 1957, the watch was introduced. The earliest Speedmaster is the Dash 1, 2915-1. A few main things about it: the broad arrow hour hand. It's just so dynamic, the big triangle. It also had a steel bezel, which wasn't that easy to see. You could see why only a couple years later they introduced a black aluminum bezel, much easier to read with the contrast. But the key defining features of the watch are the screw-down case back, the tachymeter bezel, which was the first time that had been done, and then the black dial with 3 registers and the Lamania movement. So the main difference between the Dash 1 and Dash 2 and the Dash 3 was that the Dash 3 was sort of a transitional reference. The Dash 3 is when they introduced this black aluminum anodized bezel.
So the 2915-1 through Dash 3 are quite rare.
Very rare, and in fact, you begin to realize how rare they are when you begin really hunting them and comparing serial numbers. There really are only a handful out there, particularly in very good original condition.
And the 2915 really existed for at most 2.5, 3 years.
Exactly, yeah, and it's estimated only a few hundred made of the Dash 1s and then of the Dash 2s.
And so then in 1960, we begin to see the Speedmaster really take shape into what we might know it today.
Absolutely, yeah, you get the defining characteristics of the black bezel that's still used today. It's anodized aluminum. This is a 2998-1. It's got what are called alpha hands, so a sort of triangular hands that extend out. The other interesting characteristic were the alpha register hands, which they later replaced with sort of thin hands that are still used today. So this is a 2998-4. It has the thin hands, but still has the alpha hands. It was during this time they switched from the bezel that had base 1000 to one that just said tachymeter.
And so would you say that there are maybe 4 or 5 attributes of all Speedmasters that you really have to look at to tell what it is? And that's obviously the dial, certainly. So there's professional, pre-professional. There's the bezel, whether it's steel or black. If it's black, is it base 1000 or base 500? There's the dot over 90 as well. There's the hour-minute hands, of course. Then there's the sub-register hands.
Absolutely.
And so the 2998 went from Dash 1 through Dash 62.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dash 1, 2, 3, 4. Then 61 and 62. Essentially the 62 and the 61 were the exact same as the 105002, which was essentially just a renaming and recoding. Only about 2,000 were made, it's estimated. The earliest ones still had the alpha hands, but then later ones had baton hands within the reference, and that led us right into the 105003, which is commonly known as the Ed White. It's thought that he wore a Dash 6-4 on his famous spacewalk in 1965, shortly after it had been flight qualified by NASA. And there's a couple variations between the 6-4s and the 6-5s, including often the caseback didn't have perlage on the inside.
So it's around 1964-65 that we begin to see the message of the Speedmaster start to take shape. And that this is now moving away from a racer's watch. And there were watches from the 1960s that were issued to the Peruvian Automobile Club, so this really was a driver's watch up until 1964-65.
Absolutely, and it's not like the tacky bezel was that useful in space, but they just retained it as part of the watch.
Sure.
The big transition was when they transitioned to the professional version, and it had a completely different case, and there's sort of a myth around that they saw Ed White wore the watch on a spacewalk, and then they decided to call it the professional, but in fact they had to actually come out with the professional before that happened. It was just part of their development of making a better watch. So they felt that one of the weak points of the early Speedmasters was the exposed crown. If it gets hit basically with a strong metal surface, the crown could break off and the stem could break, so you couldn't wind it or set the time. So they developed this case that had crown guards. The crown was essentially protected. It was similar to what Rolex did with the sub, and the pushers were more protected as well. So they called it the professional to differentiate it from the earlier versions.
And what year would we see the earliest professional dials?
Those were around 64. There are very few 105012-63s out there, and then 64s and 65s. NASA had ordered a number of these, and Neil Armstrong, for instance, had a 105012-65. There's a couple variations. This one has a CB code on the inside for a case company that had a slightly different case style. It has beveled lugs versus the HF cases, which were made by Huygens and Frere. Huygens and Frere had basically made all the early Speedmaster cases. And this had lugs that didn't have a bevel. They call them lyre lugs. Then from that time, there was a transition to the 145012-67. Again, essentially the same thing, and they were using up the last 3-2-1 movements. Some of those had a fancy end of the chrono seconds hand, and others had a straight seconds hand. So both can be correct on the 145012.
So after the 145012, we move away from the 321 movement. And there, I would say, are two defined classes in Speedmasters. It's the 321s and then everything else. There really is a distinction in terms of collectability and value for the 321 versus the later 861.
Absolutely. The 861 was essentially easier to produce, and they really began producing a lot more Speedmasters with the 145022-69. It's thought that only about 40,000 Omegas were made with 321 movements during that period, so really finding a good 321 Speedmaster is becoming ever more difficult each day.
Right, and when you say 40,000 Omegas, that includes other families as well. So that's what I think a lot of people forget, is that these movements were used in other Omega products.
Yeah, exactly.
And so tell us a little bit about the earliest 861s.
So the earliest 861s had the painted logo. They still had the case back with the hippocampus logo, and some of the Dash 69s had paint that turned quite tropical over time. So that can be appealing and very collectible. And then they switched to commemorate the success of the Apollo 11 mission with a watch that had this straight writing on the back and the Omega logo. Then after that is when they introduced the case that said it was flight qualified and first and only watch worn on the moon.
And then this last watch we have here is really the Speedmaster that took us through the better part of 2 decades.
Absolutely. This one was essentially just a standard Speedmaster, and it spent a year in space on the Mir space station from 1993 to 1994. It essentially has all the characteristics of the earlier ones, except, the printed writing's a little different, Omega's a little bigger in the logo. And it's still the moon watch today with the Hesalite crystal, and remains certainly a cornerstone of Omega's company.
The Speedmaster, to many of us, represents what a watch should be. It's sporty, it's a chronograph, black dial, manually wound, has great history behind it. This is what watches are about. In your opinion, what is the ultimate Speedmaster, and what makes it so special?
I mean, the 2915-1s, certainly they're the most valuable and most important. And when you look at how rare they are, I really still think they're undervalued. I think the 2998s are still undervalued, particularly ones that are all original. They're really, truly uncommon to find with the original base 1000 bezel and not polished badly original crowns and hands. It's very difficult. It's one of those watches that I think is one of the most famous watches because of its role with space. And sort of like the sub is so identified with James Bond, the Speedmaster is so identified with space. And it's those watches that as a kid you remember seeing the advertisements for, and you say, one day when I've made it, I'm going to own one of these. And there's so many people you see walking around that have, 20-year-old Speedmaster, and they never want another watch. That's the one watch they have, and they'll be happy with it the rest of their life, and they'll be happy to pass it to their kids.
Yeah, I always say, a lot of young guys come up to us and say, I want to spend $5,000 on my first great watch. And I say, well, you can make it a Speedmaster, but it's also going to be your last great watch. And it's one of those things, you walk into a room with $1 million Patek collector or anything, and you're wearing a Speedmaster, and you can hold your head proud, and that collector will kind of give you a head nod and say, you did the right thing.